Hey guys, it's Danny. Today we're starting off a new series on my channel called The Problem With. Now, this series doesn't aim to bash products or materials or whatever I'm going to talk about. The aim is to inform you about certain materials, certain products, their quirks and not so good features, just for you guys to actually know how to bypass some of them, or if some are suited in certain setups or with certain plants, and so on and so forth. These are all products that I actually used. I have footage to show you, I have experience to talk about, but really with some of these, I wish I also had somebody to tell me about the not so pleasant stuff or the things that could happen to these materials, simply because I didn't know everything I should have known about them. Today's video will focus on moss poles, specifically sphagnum moss poles, which is weird because sphagnum moss is my absolute favorite material medium for plants, orchids. It's so versatile, I love it so much. But here's the thing, when I started to grow plants, specifically orchids, this material was so incredibly polarizing that I got all sorts of very angry comments on my videos stating that I'm out of my mind recommending people using sphagnum moss because it kills plants. And that's because sphagnum moss is a very special material. It definitely has a learning curve, it can be wonderful, but equally absolutely horrible at the same time, if misused or used in the wrong setups. And as it just so happens, sphagnum moss poles are becoming very popular. I see them more and more on Instagram, and in my mind, I keep playing that experience that I had at the beginning of my orchid growing experience. And I feel there will be a lot of very sad or discouraged people very soon. So I'm here to give you the downside or the stuff you should be aware of when it comes to sphagnum moss and sphagnum moss poles, just for you to better decide if this is something you want to try out, and if you do, maybe try out first with one plant rather than investing a lot of money into something like this or DIYing it and put all of your plants on moss poles. And why not, maybe you can find solutions for the problems that I will talk to you about today. So first and foremost, what is a moss pole? It's not this. This is actually a cocoa coir or cocoa fiber pole or totem pole. People call it many different ways, including moss pole, but moss pole is incorrect because this is not moss. Literally, it's coconut fiber. It's made out of coconuts, and it's vastly different than a proper sphagnum moss pole. Now, cocoa poles have been used for a lot of time, and many companies manufacture them because they have many advantages. They offer a very fluffy medium for roots to attach to. If you water them or shower them, they can retain some water. And third, they degrade very, and I mean very slow. Why do they degrade slow? Because cocoa fiber is actually a water repellent. And I'll link you to an article down below that talks a little bit more about it. Back in the day, they used to make nesting material for birds out of cocoa fiber because it didn't actually retain that water. It didn't absorb it and spread it evenly. Yes, it can get wet, but it doesn't actively retain the water. And yes, it can hold on to a few drops of water, but it doesn't hold it in. Certainly not in big quantities. Now, of course, this cocoa coir pole has benefits, but also some disadvantages, and why people are starting to go towards the moss poles. It doesn't actually retain water for the roots. In order to water the aerial roots of whatever plant you want to mount on this cocoa pole, you need to shower it or mist it or whatever. This pole will not help you out, and it will not draw water from the medium upwards towards the aerial roots. It's just something to lean the plant on or tie it to. So being that sphagnum moss is a type of material which is pretty much the total opposite of cocoa coir, you can see how people made the connection and started to combine the two. And well, I know for a fact it will not be the greatest experience for everybody. But to get to that, we need to talk a little bit about the properties of moss and see how it actually works. Sphagnum moss, as I was saying, is I think my favorite medium. It has some properties that no other medium on the market for orchids or other plants actually has. It's not suited for all plants, obviously, but it's very suited for orchids, be them epiphytic, terrestrial, semi-terrestrial. It is very suited to root cuttings, sprout seeds even. With this material, we can actually create some orchid setups, which I'll show you. It is super useful. And what makes it so useful is its capacity of retaining water. This is dry moss, but if I were to wet it, it would hold on to so much water that it would weigh 10 times more. So it is absolutely incredible at water retention while maintaining things airy at the same time. Because yes, soils and actually cocoa peat is water retentive as well. Why is this better than that? Well, this is airy. Each strand is not fine and it will not become mushy. Good quality sphagnum moss, even if you press it a little, it will still maintain its shape. It will still retain air pockets while retaining a lot of water. And this is exactly what epiphytic orchids want. Water and air at the same time. And orchids are not the only plants that like this. Some aroids like it too. Maybe even some anthuriums. You can root some cuttings in this thing. Oh, hello. Yes, I have a Florida ghost and I love it to bits. I did not think I would love this plant, but that's a totally different story for a different video. Isn't he beautiful? Anyway, many people root plant cuttings in sphagnum moss. And for the main part, it is pretty great. Water retentive, airy, and if this wasn't enough, it's so hecking absorbent you'd believe it's microfiber. See, not only does this thing retain water, but it also absorbs it and distributes it super evenly. So if you have an entire pot of sphagnum moss and you just pour a little bit of water on the top, or you put this pot sitting in water, the sphagnum moss will absorb all of that water and it will distribute it super evenly through the pot. You will not have very wet medium at the bottom and very dry at the top, which happens a lot with bark chips, if you've ever had orchids and bark chips, and some other media which are not so absorbent. So with sphagnum moss and sphagnum moss combinations, you never need to worry about layering. Moss is the thing that evens everything out. It's the thing that absorbs stuff. It's the thing that works with self-watering. And guess what? People are calling moss poles self-watering poles. And this is because if you have a part of a moss pole inside a pot which has water, that sphagnum moss will absorb the water and bring it up, maybe even to the top, depending how much water it has in there. Yes, my friends, sphagnum moss is the best thing pretty much ever on planet Earth when it comes to plants. Almost. What could possibly be wrong with it? Sadly, quite a few things that we need to have in mind in order to have a good experience with it. Because not knowing about these things actually made in the past a lot of orchid growers so angry with me for promoting sphagnum moss and so against sphagnum moss and just so sad about using sphagnum moss and killing their orchids. If you don't know how to arrange this medium inside a pot, you can compact it so much that you can suffocate roots. And this is a problem mainly with orchids. If you wet the sphagnum moss and then you press it really tight, it will get so compacted that air will not circulate freely around the root system. And as it just so happens, many orchid nurseries really compact sphagnum moss around orchid roots to maintain them in place rather than staking them. Many people have a lot of issues with orchid roots because of this. It's not the sphagnum moss's fault, actually, it is the way you prepare it in the pot. And of course, the more sphagnum moss you have in a pot, the more water you'll have as well, because everything will retain that water. But hey, we're not talking about pots of sphagnum moss here, we're talking about moss poles, right? Yeah, well, I have a tendency to give you the whole image when I talk about something. Let's get to the moss pole and the problem there. So the sphagnum moss pole will be super moist and it will also be very water absorbent. One thing that happens when we are dealing with pretty much always moist stuff or stuff that can retain a lot of water is a very funny thing called algae accumulation. A little PS here. I always get picked on by this. Algae or algae, it doesn't matter. They're both correct. In British English, you say algae. In American English, you say algae.
Algae. Algae.
I'm not British nor American. And the best way to describe my accent, I guess, is foreign. So what I say here is what I learned along the years and what I have been taught in school. We're gonna talk about algae a lot, that's why I wanted to say this. So, when you have something always moist, you will attract algae at some point. Now, algae are some funny little creatures which are green, they photosynthesize. They can look rather cute, but at the same time, they're not super friendly to plants, especially when they become excessive. Because algae, or at least some of them, produce a byproduct, which is more or less a toxin designed to compete with other plants for space and nutrients. Except water, algae also really enjoy light and nutrients. The more water, light, and nutrients you have, the more algae you will have as well. Now I'll give it, some environments have more algae than others. I sadly live in an environment which is absolutely filled with algae spores everywhere. It's an island. Maybe that has something to do with it. For me, algae is more prolific than grass. And I'm not even joking, and I have footage to show you. So, what do we have with a moss pole? Well, we have water all the time because that's the purpose of it, to wick water and to be self-watering and wet all the time or most of the times. We also have light. It's outside of the pot, it's on top. It is exposed to the same light that your plant is exposed to. And also we will have nutrients because yes, you will fertilize your plant, or the soil you are going to use already has fertilizer in it. So what you will have on that moss pole will be an algae playground. Now the algae will develop sooner or later depending on your environment, but trust me when I say they will develop. And in very, very extreme cases, they can really play a number on plant roots because of those toxins they can release. Furthermore, if you have the blue-green algae, which is not an algae, the cyanobacteria, it can get really, really out of hand. It can get seriously dangerous, not only for the plant, it can start to smell really bad, and generally speaking, the plant you are going to attach to that pole will be at risk. And I do have some footage to show you from my own experience. As I was saying, I live in an environment which is very prone to algae spores in the air. Algae absolutely loves sphagnum moss. If there's something they love most in this world is sphagnum moss. They constantly form on top of the medium if I use sphagnum moss in a pot. And not only, there are some setups with orchids which we call moss mounds, which look a little bit like moss poles, right? They just don't have the pole in the middle. Yeah, those stuff, oh boy. In 3 to 4 months, they are covered in a thick layer of algae. The more light I give, the more algae I will have as well. And on the screen, you have my Neophonetia orchids, which I had to sadly repot recently because all of the root tips were completely damaged by the algae. A little bit of algae is not a huge deal, but the more you have this set up and the more time passes, the more algae will accumulate. And in my experience, algae absolutely has an effect on plants, on the roots specifically, and of course they will compete for nutrients with plants as well. When it comes to using sphagnum moss exposed to the elements like that in the orchid world, we use temporary setups. This is a setup in which I'm just rooting a cutting, and then in a few months I remove this, I place the cutting somewhere else, and hey presto, we're done with the moss. With the Neophonetias that I showed you, that style typically gets renewed once a year because inevitably the sphagnum moss will become so full of algae, it's not gonna look good, it's gonna smell bad, and it's gonna affect the orchid. Some people will not have as many algae as I do, but definitely some people will. So whenever we use exposed moss like this, we use temporary setups. Now, does a moss pole qualify as a temporary setup? No. You want a moss pole to stabilize your plant. And furthermore, you want it to deliver water. That's why you use it, right? So you are going to keep it wet and you are going to keep it at least over a year with that plant. It will accumulate algae sooner or later, so you need to think about that in advance. Now, you can start to manually spray something to remove that algae. And the solution that I found works to some extent is hydrogen peroxide. I would use 3% concentration, not more than that. You can find hydrogen peroxide at the pharmacy. It is used for treating minor wounds or cuts, but in my experience, that's just a little patch. It does not resolve the issue. It can actually keep it under check. In very heavily algae-prone environments, it's not gonna do the job. I couldn't really handle it with only hydrogen peroxide, but in some environments which are not super prone to algae, it can do the job. So if you're using a moss pole, maybe have some hydrogen peroxide at hand. When you first see algae, spray it right away. And I hope that will keep the moss pole in check if your environment is not super prone to algae. But algae is not the only issue that the sphagnum moss will have. Another issue you can confront yourself with is very fast degradation. Now, sphagnum moss can be of higher quality or of lower quality. This is the brand that I like for my orchids because I use it as a continuous medium. I need it to last me as long as possible. And P.S., this has not been sent to me. This is not a sponsored video. It's a brand that I like. So the best growth sphagnum moss, in my experience, is the most long-lasting moss because moss actually tends to degrade pretty fast. The wetter an organic material sits, the faster it rots and breaks down. It's the rules of nature. That's why cocoa coir is not fast to degrade because it does not hold on to that water. That's why we make these types of pulps. Now, on the market, there are sphagnum mosses which are not so high quality. I don't know what type of moss this is, but it does not look like this. Do you see the color difference? So I'm guessing this is a sort of moss intended for reptiles. Also, on the market you will find chili moss. I find New Zealand sphagnum moss to be more long-lasting. So if you're gonna DIY it or purchase one, go for one that specifies the type of sphagnum moss they used, or use a good quality sphagnum moss, which might be a little bit more costly, but it will last you longer. This being said, it doesn't mean that it will last you forever. This sphagnum moss, if you keep it wet all the time, can last you a year and a half, a year, 2 years, depending on many things, depending on your environment, on the plants you have on them, on the amount of algae you have on it. Algae will spoil sphagnum moss as well. There are many, many variables here. I don't know how much this will last before it starts to rot down. So what's the problem with rotting? It's a natural process. Well, the problem is, one, you're gonna lose it from the pulls, or you're gonna be left with the plastic pulp. Second, this stuff gets so acidic, it might actually compete with vinegar. I'm not sure, but this sphagnum moss, if I test the pH, it's around 5, brand new. Can you imagine when it starts to degrade? And through degradation, it gets more acidic actually. Can you imagine how acidic it can become in time? The problem with this much acidity is that it can actually affect roots. It can burn them. It can create an environment which is not adequate for the roots, nor for the stem actually. And I'll get to the stem because we have some issues there as well. Now that we know a thing or two about sphagnum moss, let's talk about the concept of a wet pole pretty much all the time. Yes, the roots will appreciate it, that's for sure. But will the stems appreciate it? And I don't need to remind you that I had some issues with some rotting Monstera stems. Well, you might get away with it, you might not. Again, it depends a lot on environment. And you'll see me talk about environment a lot. If there's one thing that more than 7 years of constant comments and opinions and stuff has taught me, is that everybody has such a different environment that everything you can think of can happen will happen for somebody. So some people will not have issues having a wet moss pole with all sorts of acidity and all sorts of little molds. Oh yeah, you can have molds on sphagnum moss as well in some environments, not only algae. So all sorts of little molds, all sorts of algae, all sorts of little pathogens that thrive in high humidity, so close to stems. Will that be okay for some people? I don't believe it will be. I think the drier you can keep a stem, the better. One thing that environments might differ in is the quantity of pathogens and the quality of the air in the area. From that point of view, let's say. Typically, more humid environments can hold more pathogens in the air. These types of plant pathogens really thrive in high moisture. Then again, you can have parts of the world which have a certain affinity to certain pathogens. Do you have powdery mildew? I don't, but I'm sure some people do. See, my environment is not prone to that, but it is prone to algae. So how this super wet pole will affect the stems of each plant for each person, it is hard to determine. It's something you should definitely keep an eye on, because having something wet next to Monstera stems all the time gives me nightmares, to be fully honest, but maybe it can work for you. If you have workarounds for many of these things that I told you, that's great, and that's what you should take from this video. If you want to try it out, absolutely try it out. It's one thing to talk about it, another thing to try it out, right? Even though I have so much experience with all sorts of similar stuff. I will also link you to all of my experience in my videos down below in the description that pertain to this subject. If you are thinking that the moss pole will solve all of your issues and you're gonna put all of your 20 plants on moss poles right now, just don't. You have to trust me on this one. Whenever you're trying out a new product, whatever that product might be, and I'm speaking from a very painful experience here, always try it with 1 or 2 plants. Do not try it with all of them. Do not try it with your most expensive plants. If you've never used sphagnum moss, don't use sphagnum moss with your, I don't know, insert very expensive plant here. just don't. Try it out with something else first. Learn how it works. I can tell you the basics, but what if you discover something new in your environment with sphagnum moss that I didn't experience so far? It can happen. Do you want it to happen on a 500-year-old plant? Maybe not. I'm just saying. So the thing with moss poles, they can be great additions to some people. I have a funny suspicion that for at least some of you, they will not be what you think that they will be. So that's the point of this series, to shed light on stuff that can pose issues, not to focus necessarily only on the negative, but hey, the negative exists. If we're gonna ignore it, we're not gonna do anything. I always like to be proactive about things, and if you know my orchid videos, you know that I never believe something is either white or black or good or bad. It's always in between. There are always pros and cons to everything, but knowing about these things can actually help you overcome them or decide what is actually best for you, or create totally new products that we all can enjoy. So that's it. Thank you guys so much for watching this video. I hope you found it useful, and let me know down below what your experience has been with sphagnum moss poles, how long have you been using them, sphagnum moss in general, and so on and so forth. And don't forget to check the description. I will be sure to put a lot of information, a lot of my experience there as well. And I always encourage you to do your own research and just think things through before you take an action. I hope you enjoyed hanging out with me today, and with that said, I'll see you next time. Bye!